So good evening, everyone. My name is Paulo Góes. I am the Dean of the Eller College of Management. It's a great pleasure to have you here today to participate in our first installment of the Dean's Speaker Series. It's something that we decided to put together, and the idea is to have one such lecture and session every semester. I really believe that the role of a business school is to stay connected with the community, to bring together students, faculty, our great staff, and members of the community. And in particular, I'm very pleased to welcome all those alumni from the Eller College and University of Arizona. Let's see a show of hands. How many of you are alumni from the U of A? From Wildcats. How many of you are alumni from the Eller College or the BPA? Wow, that's very impressive. So I don't have to tell you how great this college is. I've been here now Dean for over 2 years. I was department head before, so I've been around this college for 10 years, and I'm very proud to be doing what I'm doing. We have a great college. Our rankings are showing we're climbing. We're number 11 among public universities with the undergraduate program in business, which is a remarkable accomplishment. And we need to share the wealth of knowledge and the thought leadership with the community. So that's the premise of this event. And we will be choosing topics that are timely and relevant, and invite experts on those topics to have presentation and discussions and engage the audience. The first topic that we chose is the energy, business, and economics. It's a topic that's in everybody's mind. A lot of things happening in the energy industry. On the production side, you have the emergence of renewables. You have all the costs and the economics of what's happening with renewables, with the fossil energy, and for the impact on the environment, climate change in the background. On the consumption side, you have to think about what's coming next, the electric cars, the fourth industrial revolution, and all the new applications that are driving new forms of consumption of energy, how to store energy. And we thought there's a lot of different angles we could take that. And we assembled a great team here. We're going to start with our featured speaker, who's going to be presenting. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Schneider, who is a graduate from the University of Arizona. He works for the San Diego San Diego Gas and Electric. There you go. All these different levels, right? So Mike is currently the Vice President of Clean Transportation and Asset Management for San Diego Gas and Electric. In this role, he oversees clean transportation, asset management, growth and technology integration, strategic planning, and business optimization. Most recently, he was the Chief Environmental Officer and Vice President of Operations Support for both San Diego Gas and Electric and Southern California Gas Company, Sempra Energy's regulated utilities in California. His responsibilities included facilities, fleet services, environmental services, real estate, and land services for both companies. I visited Mike a couple months ago, and he took me to the big control room, the operations room. Very impressive setting, and I couldn't help but think about what Mike was doing 2 weeks ago during the fires in California, and I heard he was literally living in that control room. So we may talk a little bit about that. But Mike holds a master's degree in business administration from George Mason University and a bachelor's in economics from our college and our university. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Mike Schneider to come to the podium and give his presentation.
Can you all hear me okay? Thank you so much, Paulo, for that introduction. And boy, after Saturday, I didn't know if I wanted to show up here or not. What happened? What happened? You know, hey, I live and breathe it too, guys, constantly. I mean, once a Wildcat, always a Wildcat, right? So next year, we got to win it next year, okay? Because I don't like listening to the ASU people talking about their school, their football, anything. But in any event, it really is an honor to be here and talk about a topic that, to me, I see no right now urgent point in time where this topic really resonates and what's going on globally, what's going on nationally, what's going on out in California. And Paulo did talk a little bit about the wildfires that we had experienced most recently, and very tragic fires, particularly with the town of Paradise and the Camp Fire, which was really a major tragedy. And we also had the Woolsey Fire burning down in Malibu and Ventura in that area. And 2 weeks ago, you know, I was sequestered in our emergency operating center doing 12-hour shifts, 5 to 5, de-energizing customers and then bringing them back as we prepared for the Santa Ana events that were happening at the exact same time. And I can tell you, our weather situation was actually more severe than the weather conditions that started those two fires. We got very lucky, but from my perspective, we also were in a position where we had learned a lot from fires that we had in San Diego, where we started to see climate change back in 2003 and again in 2007. And as a company, we quickly started to invest in technologies, a world-class meteorology organization, and put ourselves in a position where we could try to be better at detecting when we were vulnerable to those types of situations that are only going to get more and more extreme. It used to be that the Santa Anas would start, around September 15th and end the end of November. You knew you were clear by Thanksgiving. It was all good. You were going into the holidays. It's year-round now. It's year-round. We had fires in December of last year. I was in the EOC in January of this year. In 2014, we had 8 fires burning in San Diego with a hot event. We had 6 fires burning on July 6th of this year. 4 of them started in military institutions, which really caused a difficulty in coordination. So it's a year-round thing for us right now as a utility, and it's really changed our focus and perspective a lot on our risk management. So, part of what I'll talk about is sort of our changing utility with respect to how the environment is impacting us. But then I also want to talk about the things we're doing, because there really is a nexus with energy and with utilities in the environment. You almost want to look at a utility or an energy industry and saying, boy, they're just sort of negatively correlated, but it's quite the opposite. You've got a great opportunity with this industry to really be a leader in change. And out in California, we've been doing a lot of change, and you can see this graphic here of a lot of what we've been doing just out in the environment in San Diego and the broader San Diego areas, even up in Los Angeles with our sister companies, with respect to how we are part of the environment and how we're a leader in the environment and how we're focused on a sustainable business model that's really aligning ourselves with where we're seeing climate change and where we're seeing our opportunity to make positive differences. Positive differences in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not only in renewables, but as Paulo also mentioned, in the focus on the transportation side of the business. In fact, the transportation side of the business is even more daunting as far as emissions than stationary sources. And in San Diego, it constitutes more than 50% of our greenhouse gases, not to mention all the other pollutants that come out of the exhaust tail of internal combustion engines. So our focus on how do we help enable and accelerate that marketplace puts us in a position where we can have a sustainable business, yet align with the environment and help push things forward in a positive direction. With respect to renewables, I know here in Arizona you recently had a Proposition 127 that was on the ballot regarding a move to a renewable portfolio standard. I think it was 50% by 2030, I believe. And right now we've got one in front of us that says we're going to 100% by 2045. We are on that path. We've been on that path since the mid-2000s. And we're currently, as a company, at 45% renewable. And that does not take into account all of our distributed solar on rooftops, which we've got about 800 megawatts, about 125,000 customers, about 10% of our load now solar as far as a renewable energy source. So lots of things are happening, but it also causes a lot of other issues in the context of what we've got to deal with as a utility, because our business is changing. You know, you go back 100 years, utilities were vertically integrated. You know, they were responsible for the generation side of it, the transmission, distribution, billing all the services, and we as customers and energy consumers, we would just pay our bill to our utility service provider. And that world is changing very, very quickly. So one of the things that we're also very much focused in on is that type of change, that customer choice, that distributed change. How do you deal with all of this when you've been a vertically integrated company? Let me take a quick step back and talk very, very briefly about just my background, because I think it helps set a little context. I came out of the University of Arizona with an economics degree. I went to Washington, D.C. I was an energy economist for 4 years, worked for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, wanted to get into business once I got my master's, and actually was very interested in moving into telecommunications because it was a changing business, very rapidly changing business. But I went out to San Diego, I interviewed with San Diego Gas and Electric, and they were like a small fish in a big pond. There was a lot going on in San Diego. There are a lot of things that were challenging to them, and it really appealed to me. And we've been on that course and that journey sort of since that time frame. I joined the company back in 1992. During that time, we were importing about 80% of our energy. And we were already in a position where that vertical integration was changing and taking place. I've been very fortunate to work with the Sempra companies over my career in a lot of different changes, and now dealing with the changes that I'm talking about now, where we've got this large connective renewable supply. We've got a lot of grid issues that we're facing constantly because of that. As you guys, many of you know, electricity, unless you have a battery, unless you have a storage capability, you've got to generate it and you've got to consume it. It's instantaneous. It's not like other energy sources where you can just park it off to the side. So if you're having all of these distributed sources constantly, connected to your grid, how are you bouncing all of that together? And I know later on during our panel we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's a huge challenge for us. As a new utility, how do you do it, and how do you do it efficiently and effectively? And when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, how do you continue to have that sustainable energy source? Because as what was mentioned, we all are energy consumers, and we're becoming more and more dependent in many ways on energy in our daily lifestyles. And so we've got to make sure we've got that mechanism, that framework that brings it all together. And that's where to us, energy storage really comes into play. And you can see that graphic there. That's our graphic. That's up at our Escondido. You would like that Escondido, right, Mary? Yeah. That's our Escondido lithium battery project. That's a 30-megawatt lithium battery project. It was energized last year. At that time, it was the largest lithium battery storage project in the world. Now it has been surpassed, I think, from a project in Australia and a few others. But we are now on the process of continuing to grow our storage for a variety of reasons. One, it provides a great source of storage for all of those renewable sources. Our demand curves have changed quite markedly. In San Diego, it used to be our peak demand was from like 12 noon to about 6 p.m. And then we would kind of go through that reduction. Now with all the solar that we have connected to San Diego, we have a curve that is now shifted out into the evening time frame. So our curves have now shifted, and guess what? No solar. So now we've got a much different situation we've got to solve with storage. and storage in the context of both central storage, like you see in front of the meter, and we're starting to see consumers and customers start to buy their own storage behind the meter, whether it's a Tesla battery pack or another means. And that's just another way of having to integrate it all together as an energy company. So we're putting ourselves in a position where, one, we're aligning ourselves to a lot of the environmental issues that are in front of us right now and moving towards those reductions in greenhouse gas, those opportunities to focus on bettering the environment. In fact, in San Diego, we have one of the most biodiverse places in the world, as far as like 200 species that are protected. We've got 45% open lands. We've got a coastline that's a jewel to us that we've got to make sure we're protecting. And in doing so, we're also putting ourselves in a position of being a leader there in the state and providing these other mechanisms. But it does come at a price, and that price, again, is you've now got these issues with respect to the grid, and the other is affordability. And I think that's something that if I were here in Arizona, I would want to make sure I understood and had a good pathway forward on, because I can tell you in San Diego right now, it's getting a little scary. When I joined the company, our rates were 7 cents a kilowatt hour. And that was like a $35 bill. I mean, in San Diego, we don't use a lot of electricity for space conditioning. It's 70 degrees and sunny all the time there, right? It's a great place to be. But, average usage has gone up a little bit, and with a lot of these costs now, not only in the standpoint of just the costs on renewables, but how do you get renewables to market? Transmission, right? So we've had a lot of investments in transmission. We've had a lot of investments as far as subsidies to promote a lot of this forward. We're looking at a rate right now of about 24 cents moving to 27 cents. So that's a huge increase in rates. Now, the good side of it is we have very low usage, right, for the most part. And most of the customers that are high usage, people like me, we have our solar, right? And now we're looking, how are we going to utilize that differently and continue to grow the value proposition with respect to it? And right now our focus is on electric vehicles. And that's a great opportunity for us to, again, align with the environment and take greenhouse gas out, as well as a sustainable business for us, because every electric vehicle is like a household in San Diego as far as connective load, and it's connective load that you can fuel at the right time with the right price signal. So we've got rates that provide customers with incentives to charge when the sun is shining and we have ample energy on a circuit-by-circuit basis, which is great because it really does give that ability now to put that energy into the needed source and reduce the greenhouse gas, or in off-peak timeframes. And you can charge now on an affordability basis that puts gasoline at about 75 cents a gallon. And that's at that average rate level. So think about it. If your rates were much lower, that affordability equivalency would be even that much better. So what it does for us in the utility industry is it puts us in a new value stream. Our business is changing rapidly. We may be losing the supply side from the standpoint of a lot of the distributed sources and a lot of these other renewable loads, but we're putting ourselves into new business opportunities, one in the storage space. I talk about the 30 megawatts. We've got about 300 megawatts on our books right now that we're planning on installing, not only in the standpoint of sort of making sure we're storing that excess renewable energy that we don't need, because right now we're just dumping it to the bulk power market at pennies, and we want the value of that, but also on load resiliency, on grid enablement. There are like 13 uses of storage that we can really gain when we bring it together. One of the things I'm looking at right now, we've got a microgrid out at Borrego Springs, and I am focusing on, and the reason we have that microgrid is we have just one transmission feeder down through the mountains into the desert to that community of about 4,000 customers. And if that line goes down for any reason, and it goes down due to storms, it takes a while to get it back up, and we have a community that doesn't have power, and that's a huge issue for us. So getting that microgrid stood up so that we could effectively island that community and get them sustainable from the standpoint of generation and batteries, and we're going to be putting more batteries there because we've got a big central solar plant right up the street from one of our partners that we buy renewables from, puts us in a great position where we could effectively island Borrego once we make this next battery investment about 99% of the time and pretty much negate the need for that transmission line, which eventually we would have to replace anyway. So you've got a huge opportunity to alleviate avoided cost in that standpoint. So we see storage not only in the standpoint of what we're doing to solve some of these other renewable issues, but we're also seeing it as an opportunity for microgridding. And to me, that also has huge value in the backcountry. We talked at the outset about what I was doing 2 weeks ago in our emergency operating center. On Monday morning, when we had the event, the first thing we were doing was cutting off the backcountry, cutting off all the circuits that were having about sustainable winds of 35 to 40 miles an hour. We have algorithms. We do a very meticulous means of de-energizing. We take it very seriously, and we have the best of the best in there helping to make those decisions. As I'm giving the order to take a circuit out for safety and de-energize it for that reason, we're using that criteria, but what it's doing is it's putting those customers now where they don't have energy. A lot of them have animals, livestock. Some of them have backup generation, but a lot of them do not. They don't have the means to do that. So we're looking at microgrids and more of this opportunity to really provide that energy when we have to take the broader grid out, those vulnerable distribution and transmission lines, because they're up on the mountain peaks. They're very vulnerable to the winds, and we have to take those down and de-energize those when we have those types of conditions due to we do not want to be an ignition source. Let me mention one more thing about that, and that is going back to those investments that we've been making since those 2003, 2007 fires. I talked about our meteorology group. The other two things we've done is not only in our means of detecting and really being on top of the weather, and that really that was apparent to me this last event, but back in July, when we had the big fires back in July, no one knew it was coming. The National Weather Service did not issue a red flag report. So Camp Pendleton, they were out doing mortar practice on one of the most ignition-sensitive days because they had no idea. They did not know how vulnerable we were to that weather. All of a sudden, we had the heat just come down for the day and the winds start to move, and they didn't know about it because the National Weather Service had not issued that report. We knew about it. We were 3 days ahead on that. We had our models ready to go, so when those first fires started to happen, we also have optical cameras throughout all of San Diego. If there's a fire, we're going to see it. And when we see it, we get eyes on it right away. When we get eyes on it right away, we also share it with CAL FIRE. CAL FIRE has the controls to our optical cameras. They zoom in on it. They dispatch their teams. They actually have dispatch authority over our air resources. We have a large, what we call now the Air Maverick. It was the helitanker that we used to construct some of our transmission facilities. We've now converted that into effectively a giant mobile fire engine that can extinguish. And the key with that is it can get very precise on moving embers. And when you are in that condition, that's what you want to get. You want to get it before it moves. And then when those embers go, you want a source that can be very micro and very big in its impact. So we dispatched the Sky Crane to a few of those fires and got very fortunate as far as not letting them get ahead of themselves, working very closely with CAL FIRE. So all of these technologies now are sort of kind of coming to bear in our industry. And these are things none of us, when I joined the industry, I never thought I was like a fire guy. I never thought I would be a battery guy. I never thought I would be any of these things that are now becoming very, very, they're just pervasive, in our industry now. So we're managing risks a completely different way. We're looking at new markets in a completely different way. And we're trying to align ourselves with an environment that's changing very, very rapidly. And I talked earlier about just how we're seeing it with our general Santa Ana conditions. But I can tell you that environment with sea level rise, with just our own hardening, we're seeing it out in San Diego quite a bit. We're seeing a lot less of what we used to have as May gray and June gloom when the fogs would come in. Those don't come in quite as much as they do anymore. So last March, we had a big climate adaptation summit where we brought all of our academics, all of our environmental leaders together, and we came together as a community and we said, what are we going to do about this? And how are we going to focus in on not only the issues related to power, but the issues related to water, the issues related to biodiversity, the issues related to forestation, the issues related to our animals and all of the other habitats that are affected by this. And we've now become much more of a community partner when it comes to those types of things as well. And that's sort of the last piece of where I've seen a lot of change happen in the industry is this issue related to partnerships. Where in the past, as a vertically integrated company, you might have a contract for your fuel source, for your generation plant. You sort of had a robust supply management outfit, but you really didn't have deep business partnerships like I'm starting to see take root and take place now in our industry. We're partnering with the folks that are building these battery storage units, and we're starting to focus in on how we want and how we're going to define our grid going forward. Are we going to define ourselves as an open grid and kind of all comers? Are we going to have a marketplace that we're going to stand up for it? Because if you think about it, if consumers now have distributed solar, if they have battery, they're trying to match their own supply and demand, and oftentimes there's going to be a disequilibrium on that, and there's a great opportunity to start to define a marketplace where you can sell to your neighbor. That would be a huge uplift in this space and something to think about for going forward. So as you're sort of focusing on this march to how we do renewables, that's another area that is key for us is how do we stand this market up and how do we be a part of this market so that we're keeping ourselves relevant, we're keeping ourselves sustainable, and we're constantly adapting to what's going on and what's going forward. So, as folks here are thinking about what do renewables mean, again, and what does this whole area mean to you, I do go back to, you've really got to define your pathway forward. You got to define where those critical points are. One of the things that I keep saying in California is, the one thing beyond the affordability that I'm concerned about is we're marching to green the grid in more of a sequential fashion than a parallel approach to marching to deal with all of our greenhouse gas emissions things. Because you've got them, as I mentioned, you've not only got them from the standpoint of energy supply, but on vehicles. You've got them on building stock, you've got them on industry, you've got them in agriculture. How are you doing all of these segments and sectors and doing it in a manner that's the most cost-effective basis? I had a study done by one of our economic firms up in San Francisco a year ago because I was concerned that we were putting way too much subsidy into the solar industry and that we were not really focusing in on where's the best bang for the buck. And the study came back and showed it's a 10-for-1. If we were to subsidize electric vehicles, we'd get 10-for-1 of greenhouse gas coverage in the next subsidy into the renewable space. And to me, that was very enlightening. And that confirmed we got to be in that market. And we've got to stand that market up and move that market fast because, again, you've got economics you've got to focus in on. Now, whether that's a perfect 10-for-1, I think that the key for me was it was a good ballpark to give me a sense that this is a business that is very valuable, and it's something that we as Californians need to really push on. Now, the governor has recently, or ex-governor soon to be, Jerry Brown has recently put a goal out there of 5 million vehicles by 2030. So I think there is a tendency to understand now 5 million EV vehicles by 2030, that this is an area we want to focus in on. And so with us, this is going to be our next big load focus is this whole issue with energy, electric vehicles and how do we facilitate the charging. And so we've already got programs. In fact, we're about ready to conclude. We've got a program we call Power Your Drive where we are putting in between 3,000 and 3,500 chargers in multifamily and workplace because that's great areas to focus in on. I mean, garage charging is also an important space, but to us, those were two gaps that we needed to jump in on. We are just about ready to conclude that one, and we're about ready to start a big residential program with garages as well as a medium heavy duty charging program as well, recognizing that there are a lot of pollutants in those larger industrial and fleet vehicles, and getting them off the road and providing charging actually is a great opportunity to partner and work closely with companies like Amazon, UPS. You guys see what's going on right now. Those boxes are showing up at your doors constantly, right? You know, and they're not just like appearing. They're being delivered through a carbon source. So how do we get that carbon source off the road? So another big push for us in that area. So, I mean, I just wanted to give you guys kind of an overview of what's going on right now. Do we have it right? I don't know. I have no idea. I can tell you, it's been a very interesting journey. I can tell you, I feel very fortunate about what happened 2 weeks ago as far as our focus around, you know, sort of, I'll call it sort of wildfire risk adaptation. But we have a ways to go there too. We recognized a lot out of that incident that was concerning. And again, that affordability issue, I think, is one that we've got to keep in the forefront. And we've got to make sure folks understand those pathways forward so that we can have good, sustainable decision-making down the line if we want to move as a society towards more of this green space. Because I can tell you, if we don't do it through the course of these types of investments, and you guys are in a good position because you now are sort of riding the wave of a lot of technology, a nascent technology that's come into play right now with batteries, with solar. In fact, our Semper Energy just got out of the solar business because it's been so commoditized. I mean, right now it's a great market to be in if you can pound things into the ground and set them up and connect to a transmission basis. But it's pretty cost effective now, and you're going to see the same thing with batteries. I can tell you the lithium batteries right now that you're seeing, we're starting to focus on flow batteries and other chemical compositions that are starting to come into play because we see those cost curves really coming down. I sort of apply the same method on Moore's Law. I remember Moore's Law in microprocessors, that every few years you double the capacity and reduce the cost in half. Same thing's happening in the battery technology world. The one concern with the battery, though, is you've got cobalt, which is one of the resources, which is, I mean, that's a supply-side risk, right? I mean, cobalt is manufactured in Africa, and we've got to make sure there's plenty of cobalt, but there's a lot of money going into new technologies, a lot of money going into aluminum and other sources, sort of replacing that cathode technology and looking at other ways of doing things, and you're in a perfect position to capitalize on that. This market is moving, and it's moving very rapidly. It's that ability to bring it all together that really makes a big difference. I'm going to stop there because I know I'm a minute ahead of my time, and I want to make sure I'm prudent, and Mary would stop me anyway. So with that, guys, I'm going to stop on my speech, and we're going to move on to our panel. So thank you very much.
This was a fascinating overview. It touched upon all the issues that we thought about, we should be talking about. And the format that we chose for this event is to follow the presentation with a panel discussion, a roundtable discussion. So if you have questions for Mike, hold them up until the end. You have the opportunity to ask those questions. So we assembled a great panel. Since we started with a California point of view, we have two Arizona companies represented to counter, or to kind of serve as the counterpoint. We also have one of our faculty members, illustrious career in energy economics, and to introduce them and to moderate the panel, I'd like to invite Mary Varley to come. Mary lives here in Tucson. She's the CEO and managing partner of New Point Marketing, Strong Point Opinion Research. She has more than 30 years of experience in marketing, media, education, government, and association management. In 2003, she founded Strong Point Marketing, an award-winning marketing strategy and market research firm, which recently merged with a digital video agency to form New Point Marketing. So she holds a bachelor's degree in communications and an MBA, and she's also nationally accredited in public relations. So Mary, please join us here to be our moderator.
Thank you. We do have a great panel of experts to lead us through this important topic, and I will introduce them to you. At the end is Greg Cameron, Director of Nuclear Communications at Arizona Public Service, and he's responsible there for employee communications, external relations, public outreach, and community affairs, and he does that at the nation's largest generator of clean, carbon-free electricity. He has a bachelor's in industrial engineering and management from Oklahoma State and an MBA from UVA. And Greg's also a management senior reactor operator certified and is also a licensed professional engineer. So welcome, Greg. Patricia Ewanski, did I say that right? Is a senior energy efficiency program manager at Salt River Project, where everybody who's not familiar with SRP, it's water and electricity service in Metro Phoenix. And at SRP, she designs and manages programs to help commercial customers reduce energy consumption, not only in their buildings, but also in their operations. She's a WA grad with an MS and an MBA. She's a certified energy manager, project management professional, and she's LEED accredited. And Stan Reynolds, Vice Dean of Faculty and Research and Eller Professor of Economics. He's teaching and doing research in the area of energy and environmental economics. His bachelor's is in mathematics from Miami University and his doctorate in economics from Northwestern. His recent research focuses on integration of renewable energy into the electric grid and on performance of restructured electricity markets. And our final panelist, you've already met, Mike Schneider from San Diego. So in the next hour, we're going to explore multiple facets of this topic, and then we will save time for questions from you all. So save them up and we will get to you. My job is to keep us on track, which may require me to call time out a few times and things like that, but I will keep us on track one way or the other. So first we want to give our panelists a chance to make a few opening comments, and Mike will let you off the hook on that one since you gave us a great keynote, and we'll start with Greg.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks to the Dean and to everyone at Eller for having all of us, and especially me here tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to come home. I live with an ASU graduate and work with a number of them, so it's been a painful few days, as Mike mentioned, so it's good to be among friends. So as Mary mentioned, I have the pleasure and privilege of working at the largest carbon-free electric generating station in the country. And I've been with APS and at Palo Verde for about 10 years. And Palo Verde is an Arizona asset. So we are nearly 50% owned by APS or SRP. We're the largest single taxpayer in the state of Arizona with a $55 million property tax bill. And actually, and for those of you that are from Tucson that may not be as familiar, if you just get on I-10, you drive 160 miles and hang a left. You're right at my office there at Palo Verde, about 50 miles west of Phoenix. So we produce enough electricity for 4 million homes. So we're not just an Arizona asset, we're a regional asset for the Southwest. We have 7 owners from El Paso, Texas, all the way to the Southern California coast. Unfortunately, Mike's company is not one of our owners, but if we want to talk afterwards, we'd love to help you meet that clean energy standard by 2045. So I tell you that because Palo Verde's been around since 1986, almost as long as I have, and we're still introducing ourselves to people across Arizona. And that's one of nuclear power's greatest faults, is when nuclear started in the 70s and 80s across the country, we were too cheap to meter. That was the value proposition for nuclear. Today's value proposition is that we are carbon-free, and nuclear plants across the United States produce nearly 60% of the carbon-free electricity that's consumed across the country every day. Most of us don't have marketing departments. I'm a recovering engineer that has moved into communications, but we have learned as an industry that I really appreciated Mike using the word relevance, that we were relevant in the 70s and 80s for one reason, and we're relevant for a different reason today. And to bring around an old-minded industry that tends to be the electric industry and the nuclear industry specifically into understanding a new value proposition and introducing that to communities through forums like this, that we are not only a neighborhood asset in terms of jobs and economic development, but also a big carbon-free generator. So I look forward to the conversation tonight around how things like nuclear energy efficiency are silent partners to renewables and how we all work together to produce the carbon-free portfolio that we all want to benefit from as consumers. Thank you. You need that?
I don't know. Hi, I'm Patricia Ewanski. I've been in Arizona since 2001, and I came to the U of A, as the introduction said, from the IT industry. I was working at the university for a bunch of years as a programmer, and then I decided I wanted to go back to my first passion, which was to do something for the environment. Unfortunately, I graduated in 2008 from the master's programs here, and at that point, getting a job was an uphill battle. But I managed to find a job in energy efficiency because at that time, the only people that were hiring were those in energy efficiency. Everybody was interested in energy efficiency because they had stopped, a lot of people had stopped buying products or stopped using their services, and so to sort of to keep themselves profitable, they had to reduce their operating expenses, one of which is energy. So at that point, I was introduced to a consulting company, and we managed the energy efficiency programs for APS. And from that, I got really interested in the utility space. There was a lot of change, and I felt really impassioned by where it was going and the types of skills that would be needed in the utility industry, and moved over to SRP to help them manage and design new programs for their energy efficiency. And like was just said, energy efficiency is often the silent partner to renewables, but it's so important. If you can just imagine, getting a really new sports car and you're driving it around without your tires fully inflated. That would be a shame, because you're really not being an efficient consumer of that product. So efficiency is like having your tires fully inflated, and then you can take advantage of the other things. So thanks. I really enjoy being here, and it's such a privilege. You've got one. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Glad to see a good crowd here tonight. I wanted to add my thanks to Paulos, to the speaker, and the other panelists for being here. I'm really glad we could get this group together. As Mary mentioned, I'm an economist and a professor here. One of the great things about being a professor is you get a lot of freedom to choose what you want to work on and what you want to do. I've worked on a variety of topics and issues in my teaching and research over the years, but going back about 10 or 12 years ago, I started to get really interested in energy issues and the related environmental and climate issues. And given that I had the freedom to kind of pick my problems and topics, I started studying those issues and working on them and doing some teaching and research. And I'm landed here tonight. What I wanted to do in just my couple of minutes here was just highlight a couple of things I think are important and connected to some work I've been doing. And actually, Mike's presentation hit pretty much exactly the things that I wanted to highlight. So let me just maybe reiterate some of those things and highlight a little bit of what I think is important. And I'll just kind of mention three things, really. One is we're in the midst of an energy transition. It's a big transition. Obviously, Mike was talking about a lot of it as it relates to California. Gradually we're moving to a more clean energy kind of system, away from fossil fuels, with more renewables. It's a pretty uneven process, though, and not necessarily fast anywhere. It's progressing quickly in some areas, less quickly in others. When I teach my energy economics class, one of the things I cover at the beginning of the class is just kind of a depiction of where we are in terms of where does our energy come from and how do we use it. The really striking thing about it is we're still very heavily dependent on fossil fuels overall in the U.S. 75, 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuel still, even after years of progress on renewables. So, I think it's important to recognize that. We're in the midst of this transition. It's moving forward, but it's kind of uneven. It's not fast. It's a big, complex system, and it's not cheap or easy to move it quickly, partly because it's complex, very capital intensive. There are a lot of other things involved in that transition, too, with markets emerging and using opportunities for trading and prices that I think are very exciting. But energy and transition one. Another one is just innovation and technological changes. There's been some amazing things happening with technology. Mike was talking about batteries. Obviously, wind has advanced a lot. It's gotten we have bigger, more cost-effective wind turbines. In solar, some of you might know about the Department of Energy program, the Sunshot Initiative, kind of a program that they started in 2011 with a goal at the time that seemed almost crazy to me. They wanted to reduce the cost of electricity generated from solar panels by 75%. That's a huge reduction. Well, not only did they met that target, and they met it about 2 years early. I mean, the solar costs have come down so much that they met that target. The cost of electricity, at least electricity produced from sort of large-scale solar arrays, is pretty competitive with fossil fuel now. So, I mean, it's huge, huge progress, huge innovation there. Just the third one is there are lots of challenges. I mean, it's very exciting, but there are lots of challenges and problems to solve. That's, integrating large amounts of renewables into the grid is very challenging because of the intermittency and the timing of it. It creates some unique problems in terms of having to ramp up generators very quickly to meet that evening demand in many markets. Some of the work I've been doing is related to that, but I guess I'll just confine it to say I've been trying to figure out how much does it cost to sort of help to manage some of those grid integration challenges, and how does it affect the rest of the sort of grid portfolio or generation portfolio you have when you push a lot of renewables into the system.
Great, thank you. Let's start, for those of us whose interaction with electricity and utilities is flipping on a switch and being very grateful that in Arizona we have really dependable resources here for energy, so thank you all for that. But let's start with basics to get us all on the same page. We all throw renewable energy around as a term. Let's define it into what all falls under that. Patricia, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Renewable energy is any energy that's utilized, any energy that's utilized that doesn't come from a resource that can't be generated within a person's lifetime. So I looked that definition up to make sure that I had it right on the EIA and various other websites, but it has to be fairly quickly renewable. So you can imagine that things, as we talked about, solar, there's wind, there's wave generation, there's tidal, there is, what am I forgetting? Biomass, biofuels that can be grown quickly and then used and then grown quickly again within a year or more or less.
So where do we see the most growth among all those?
Obviously there's been a lot of growth in the solar. I've also seen that wind is heavily utilized, not as much here in Arizona, but in other states, wind is a huge resource that's being taken advantage of. Even abroad, there was something in the news today, I forget the name of the company, but they just invested something like $30 billion in offshore wind. So, since in Europe land is at a premium price for it, they're going offshore for theirs.
So does anyone on the panel have a sense of how we're doing in the Southwest versus the rest of the country in buildings?
My general impression is in the Southwest, we're moving at a more rapid pace. I mean, Stan had mentioned when you look at the nation, I think it's 8% renewable is sort of the national, sort of level. And like you said, there's, in the plain states, it's going to be much more wind-based. The other thing we have here is hydroelectricity. You don't want to forget that. Hydro is a wonderful source of carbon-free, but you've got to have the water source, and that's another area where climate change has a bearing. And actually, with hydro, that's another storage source with pump hydro. So that's another means of sort of looking at things. But going back to the Southwest, I think we've got sort of an acceleration happening here. I know California has been accelerating, in Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, Washington. Now you're starting to get the Pacific Northwest, but that general sense of more of that renewable focus. One other element I just wanted to very quickly mention is the area of hydrogen, because I think that's an area that we're going to start to see more and more research on as far as another means of energy source that will come into play, and a source that will probably provide a big gap stop for us in long-term storage. When you look at lithium, when you look at other things, you've got an hour, you've got 4 hours. Hydrogen, when you do it right and you can get the economics to work, provides you with a much more abundant supply, but it's getting the economics right with respect to it and how you really get the chemistries to work out with it. But that's an area, again, I see some significant growth in, and probably from the natural gas side of the business.
So Greg, where does the carbon-free energy portfolio fit into all this?
So that's a great question, and one is a nuclear guy that is close to me. So I appreciated Mike mentioning the California, the Senate Bill 100. So California's changed from a renewable portfolio standard to a clean energy standard. When you hear clean energy standard, that typically includes nuclear in whatever that requirement would be, 50%, 80%, 100%. So that's where we like to see policies change to include renewable and to include a certain percentage of renewable, but to bring nuclear into that carbon-free element, right? So once a nuclear plant is up and built, uranium, a piece of uranium the size of your pinky is the same as tons of coal or thousands of cubic feet of natural gas. So even though it is involving something that's mined from the earth, it is such dense energy that we don't have a shortage, or we don't create a tremendous economic or environmental impact, by doing the mining of uranium. So you start to see, I think you'll see that in Arizona. You've seen Commissioner Andy Tobin has put forth and put a lot of publicity behind his idea of an 80% by 2050 clean energy standard for the state of Arizona. Personally, I like that because that gives Palo Verde a place to be part of Arizona's clean energy solution. You see other states looking at that, especially states that have a large nuclear element. And it's about maintaining and preserving and taking credit for the nuclear plants that we have today, the 98 of them across the country, but also about preserving a place for advanced nuclear, right? And one technology that we haven't talked about, as we've talked about all these renewable sources, is advances in nuclear. And so there's 2 large-scale nuclear plants under development in the country today near Augusta, Georgia. So those are going to come online in the mid to late 2020s. There's also some exciting new technology in smaller, either they're micro reactors, some people refer to them as nuclear batteries, that are on the 50 to 60 megawatt scale, right? So just for comparison, Palo Verde, we have 3 1,400 megawatt units that are the largest in the country. The smallest, large-scale commercial plants that are out running today are in the 550 to 600 megawatt range. So you're looking at 10% of that. So these are our small footprint. They're small emergency planning zones. They're perfect for either buying a 6 or 12 pack of them and putting them in a small community, or taking one and putting it in a remote Alaskan fishing village, using them to power microgrids on naval bases or Air Force bases, those sort of things. So we want to make sure as a nuclear community and as utilities that own nuclear plants that when we talk about carbon-free standards, we are including all sources of carbon-free electricity.
So what are some of the barriers, Stan? Do you have a sense of that from the economic standpoint?
Barriers in terms of moving more
Getting
clean
to
energy and
more.
well, it's very challenging, as I'm sure Mike could attest further. Renewables. Well, there's a lot of first of all, there's a lot of variation in clean energy sources. As Greg was saying, you have nuclear, which is sort of termed as a baseload technology, because once you get it going, it just runs continuously, 24/7. Whereas with other renewable technologies like wind and solar, they're much more, they're essentially completely weather dependent. The sun doesn't shine at night, obviously, so solar is going to produce in the day, but only when it's, produce at a high level, only when it's sunny. And it's intermittent and sometimes kind of hard to predict. Wind is quite variable. It's, in places with good wind energy sources, like the Midwest, you can get a lot of wind generation from your turbines, but it's not always there. So if it's not always there, it's still true that people want the lights on, they want their power, and so you have to find some ways of managing that intermittency and filling in the gaps. California has batteries, but most of the country isn't very far along at all in battery storage. There's, the amount of battery storage in the grid nationally is sort of really kind of infinitesimal really at this point. I mean, it's very much a real-time supply and demand balancing system, so you have to find a way to match supply and demand and fill in the gaps. So I think at present that's probably the biggest type of challenge.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, where we're really focusing right now is not just plunking in more and more batteries, but just the operating systems. Because the operating system with the inverter, I mean, you've got to have instantaneous conversions of power to balance. And you've really got to put yourself in a position where you're doing a lot more automation. You're sort of moving away from the folks that are sort of standing behind the switching to a much more smart grid approach to how you're balancing out your demand and supply. And so our focus right now and where I'm spending a lot of my time, and that's why I brought up the Borrego microgrid, is really focusing on how do we stand that up and demonstrate that we can sort of bounce that intermittency and seamlessly do it so the customer doesn't really ever see that change from the standpoint of their own consumption patterns. The good news is I think the technology is starting to move there very rapidly. We're about ready. I just saw in the trade press today that they mentioned that we're going to be going out for an RFP here in a couple of weeks looking for some microgrid operating systems to help us from the standpoint of now looking at taking our energy storage and getting it much more seamlessly integrated with our renewable source. Right now, our combined cycle power plants, our fossil power plants in San Diego, we've got 2 of them that actually have 3 of them that are base load oriented. They're running as peakers right now. They're actually not running the way they should run because all they're doing is chasing all of those changes in solar. You got that cloud coming over and all of a sudden you've got a change and you've got a plant that's ramping up and down, and that's not how it was constructed originally to operate. So we're really trying to get ahead of it now to get ourselves back into that sense of, again, bringing it all together. And as Stan mentioned, you're doing it sort of slowly. It doesn't happen overnight, but you're trying to bring that together as you're sort of marching to that 100%.
So if utilities have roles in grid management and demand management, how does that work? Patricia, do you want to, I know that's one of your areas of scripting.
So I think for those who aren't in the industry, one of the first things that I had to learn and to kind of wrap my mind around was that normally we talk about things from the supply side. The supply side meaning that we're supplying energy, and so you can imagine if there's consumers and they're consuming energy, we have to supply the right amount of energy for them to consume. However, as we add renewables onto the grid and there's this intermittency, one of the ways that utilities can have the energy that's produced match what is needed in the load sector or on the load side of the equation is to decrease the demand for it. And if you ever hear reference to demand side, it's basically utilities saying that we can help people decrease their demand so that it matches the production of that. And there's various ways to do that. I work in the energy efficiency field, so the more energy efficient we make HVAC systems, lighting, motors, all the types of energy consuming devices out there, the more efficient they run, the less of the load on the grid. And if we're dealing with a lot of intermittency, that helps utilities to better manage that, more efficiently manage that. Also, at the same time, there's a term called demand response. And some of you may have smart thermostats at your home. And I'm not sure that if TEP has a demand response program, probably, but if you, for example, if you sign up, they'll pay you to decrease your demand on their peak days, meaning you turn your air conditioning up a few degrees. And what that helps them do is they don't have to turn on another peaker plant, or they don't, which becomes inefficient. The more you turn on and off these plants, especially ones that aren't normally turned on and off that frequently, the less efficient they run, the more quickly the mechanisms and the mechanics within them degrade. They have to be replaced more often. So, the lower amount you have to use them, the less wear and tear, and it's just more efficient, and it can be more cost effective to have these programs that entice or incent people to help us match the consumption with the production.
No, I think we'll get into it a little bit later, but grid management is one of the, it's complex to understand. We've never found a way to put it in a 30 or 60 second soundbite for an advertisement, but it is the great mission of a utility, right? And it's kind of, there's a lot of comparisons between the grid and the highway, right? Around using it as a transportation network and delivering supply, but it's also essentially infrastructure in that way. And just like you get angry with the city of Tucson when they don't fill a pothole, or they shut down a bridge, we're out there filling potholes and building bridges on transmission and distribution lines, right? And that is an important part, is an expensive part. I mean, it's a big part of your electric bill, and it's part that we talk about it in environments like this, but it's really difficult to bring the consumer on board. So it's part of our consumer education requirement, really, as the utility, is to give people a peek into that and to understand how that works in delivering your electricity and why that is such an important part of our service, I guess.
So just as every industry is facing security issues right now, what specific things, Mike, are utilities facing in the area of security?
Well, I think the biggest thing for us right now is cybersecurity. I mean, when you think about our move to technology, I mean, we've got automated switching right now throughout our service territory. We no longer are doing things manually. We're much more connected. We're much more connected to outside sources. So cybersecurity is to us probably the number one risk. We do a risk assessment every year at senior leadership, and we cascade that down. We actually file it with our regulatory bodies on where those areas of vulnerability are. And time again, that issue related to cybersecurity continues to come up. We put a lot, I talked about our meteorology group, we put a lot of investment in our cybersecurity team. I don't know who they are, but there are a lot of them. And I know that they cost a lot. And I know that they work in places that the doors are always locked, right? I never know what these guys are doing, but I actually do know somewhat of what they're doing. And a lot of what they're doing is they're testing the vulnerabilities of our system. They're doing their own probing of our systems to determine where we're vulnerable and following up on that and constantly trying to be ahead of things. And there's a cost to it. Every time we're interconnecting or doing something new, there's a cost to that testing that's taking place. You had mentioned HVAC. That's a great opportunity to put malware in if you're not focused in on making sure that you've got security around that from the standpoint of what's going to infiltrate your system. That's what happened with Target, right? I mean, they had a huge data breach because it got through an interconnected load source like that, with all of a sudden, if you're not on your guard constantly, that security can get compromised. And if that security gets compromised, we do not want other people operating our grid or doing stuff like that to us. So that is a huge focus for us. The good news is we're not only doing this, but all the utilities are doing it. We work very closely with each other. We grade each other. We share with each other, which I think is super. The more collaboration we're doing in this area just makes us all better and kind of keeps us ahead of things, because I can tell you, the bad folks out there that want to get into our systems, they're constantly doing the same things, right? Those are the computer nerd people that's all they want to do is try to get into your system and do stuff. And then there's just bad guys out there. I mean, we get briefings from the FBI all the time on kind of what's going on the dark internet and kind of what's, where our vulnerabilities are. And that security is an area right now in the cyber world that we spend a lot of time and focus on.
Very scary. Anybody else want to?
I actually had an interesting conversation with some of our cybersecurity in preparation for today's panel, and one of the interesting things that they brought up that I had no idea about was that most of the, I'll just speak for myself, I've kind of had this vision or the stereotype of who I thought would be hacking into utilities, and my colleague set me straight and he said, well, it's not really, there's two sets of hackers. It's the ones that are out to make a lot of money. They're not hacking into utilities because there's no real play for the money. The nefarious types that are trying to get into utilities are actually nation states. So I guess SRP has a top 8 list of nation states that they follow, specifically trying to figure out how do those nations, what are they looking for, how do they act, and then trying to prevent them from getting in rather than just kind of blanketly stating, hey, we're going to do such and such to our password. Maybe that's not the way that those guys or women are going to hack into our system. So they're really kind of fine-tuning and sort of segmenting who's trying to get in for what reasons and specifically preventing that from happening.
So Stan, how does this all impact the economics of this? Pricing, the rate increases, business attraction.
Yeah, there are quite a few ways. One thing I can go back to is what we were just talking about, sort of on the demand side management, and thinking of not just the supply, because I think the traditional model and the traditional way of thinking about the electricity industry has been you have utilities, often vertically integrated utilities that are delivering the energy that people want at any point in time, and their grid management had been geared around making sure they get it out there. Customers typically face more or less flat rates, so they weren't thinking of how much their electricity cost at one time of the day or another, or one time of the year or another, because it was pretty flat. I think as the system's getting more complicated and we're getting more variable supply sources, it is critical to manage the demand side, but some of that's going to depend on pricing. And you can think of that a couple different ways. One is to sort of pay people to curtail and reduce their demand when it's scarce, when the supplies are scarce. Another way is to just raise the price, and they're at peak times, and give a compensating break at times when energy is very scarce, very abundant. In California and the Southwest now, during the middle of the day, there's so much solar on sunny days that sometimes the wholesale prices actually go negative. They have so much that they're giving it away and kind of begging people to take it. So if you want to have consumers react the right way, you want them to face basically very low or near zero prices that time of the day, but face a higher price in the evening as the utilities face the challenge of ramping up. Yeah. And there are various other schemes, critical peak pricing and so on, to sort of try to manage the demand and supply balance. But I think those things are important. They're particularly important as we move more into clean energy, and the battery technologies haven't caught up yet. So I think that's a big part of the economics at this point.
They're incredibly important and incredibly difficult. And so APS moved late last year as a result of a 2017 rate case to a set of rates that have demand pricing, that have some super off-peak pricing in the winter and the fall. And consumer education, as all of us as business people know, is an incredibly difficult thing. It's, I think, even more difficult from a utility perspective, because you're asking people to change behavior and you're asking them to trust that you're actually doing something that's in their best interest, not yours, right? And most businesses, if they go out and tell you to change your behavior, it's usually going to be in the best interest of their profitability. And what we're doing is telling people, hey, we've told you for years in Arizona, run your pool pump at midnight, right? Buy a timer, run it at midnight. Now we actually want you to do that between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., right? And the first thing that comes in your mind, because you all love your power company, is what's in it for them, right? What are they going to get out of that? And so for us, it's really about re-establishing and kind of re-baselining our relationship with our customers so that they trust us when we tell them that, right? So the first idea is not what's in it for them, but, okay, that actually works. I'm actually going to read that insert in my bill and understand my pricing plan. And what we have seen as a utility is that customers are increasingly interested in where their power comes from, right? That's what drives this interest in renewables. I jokingly call it organic power sometimes, where you're willing to pay more for organic bananas, you're willing to pay more for organic power. But at the same time, it's why is my bill going up every month, right? So balancing both sides of that, educating on all fronts of that, and helping people understand that, we offer 5 or 6 rate plans. If you really don't care about the price, we have an option for that. If you really want to watch, if you want to be the person that's yelling at your husband and wife for when they're using the dryer, we have a plan that works for you as well. I live in one of those households. But it's the education part is such a heavy lift in addition to the technical lift, but it's also one of the fascinating things I think about being in what's perceived as this kind of old dinosaur industry, and one of the things that we have to really get better at and go reconnect with our customers.
Maybe I just sum up in my mind that as Stan talked about pricing, that's why I'm so bullish on EVs right now, electric vehicles. I mean, when I look at a source right now that is very adaptable to price sensitivity when you charge, I mean, it's electric vehicles. If we could not dump that renewable energy out into the grid, but put it into a vehicle that now displaces gasoline, that's a win. Everyone wins. We're all winning in that scenario. And as we see that market continue to transform, and we see the increase in the OEMs out there that are bringing these cars to market at much more accessible price points, I really am bullish on where this industry is going to go, and I'd like to see it go there a lot faster. As I mentioned before, if we're marching to just a renewable portfolio standard, 100% clean energy, and we're not bringing along the transportation sector and business at a rapid pace to deal with a lot of these opportunities to balance supply and demand, we're blowing it. We really are blowing it. And I just keep, that to me is a huge thing I keep out in our forefront is we can get this right or we can get this wrong. And to get it right really means you've got a great technology, a great business, and a great segment out there that you want to integrate quickly.
All right, let's open it up to the audience.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to hear a little bit more about this coordination and speeding up the process going forward. In particular, some of the issues you just talked about, Mike. Pearl Harbor was an excellent example of a rapid, comprehensive transformation of U.S. industry. It took about 6 months to make that. That was obviously a top-down process. We're much more politically preference into market solutions. The big issue I see going forward is that we have not priced carbon accurately, and therefore we've overproduced, we overconsume, and we've got to get back on a different track. It seems that you would be talking, as economists, you'd be talking much more about getting carbon pricing right so that the other things that aren't following up climate change. I mean, I am so proud that we got a Californian here who was talking about 100% by 2045, because I think that's realistic. It may not be enough to hold 2 degrees C. We're going to go past 1.5 very soon. And we've got to look at the methane leaks from fracking. We've got to look at a whole bunch of things real fast. And how are you going to get that coordination if the market pricing for fossil fuels isn't correct and it's way too low?
And I think those are very valid points.
That's the political question.
Yeah, and I'll tell you that whole issue with cap and trade and taxing carbon, I think, is an important point. And we've got to make sure we're doing it on a holistic basis. And we've got to, as you mentioned, and I think I mentioned in my keynote, we've got to look at things from an industry segmented perspective, not just...
Let's get the industries and utilities on board, because they're resisting the acceleration of this process. SRP, APS, let's get on board, folks. Otherwise, we got to go to municipal models. The private investor model is too slow in this country. Look at Europe. They've got intermittency problem. Northern Europe went to pump storage. They use gravity, a principle of the universe. You don't have to pay for gravity. And it's a secure system. You pump the water up, the water's going to fall down. You don't have to worry about cobalt or lithium or countries that don't want to sell their rare earths.
I don't have any pump storage. I want pump storage because I do like that a lot. Because
Why do Americans resist that?
Give somebody
We
else.
have a question in the back.
I have a question for anybody on the panel. What's it going to cost us to decommission Palo Verde?
That's a good question. And it's not a number that I have off the top of my head. I will tell you that we are on track. There's a federal law that where we have to be on our decommissioning fund, and we are on track with that. So the money is, it's not, nuclear decommissioning is not, we got to turn it off and then we got to go ask you for more money. That's built into the rate base for the plant over the estimated life of the plant. Palo Verde is currently licensed to run until 2047. We have 20-year extension opportunities on top of that, and we make decisions in mind with at least one more 20-year extension. So we would like to think 2067 is the end time for us. If you see me after this, I will get you the exact number because I know they have that. It's just not one that I carry around in my mind, quite frankly.
Next question?
Yeah, this question's probably more for Mike, but I was interested in, I recently was looking at buying an electric car. I talked a lot about electric vehicles. The problem that I see with electric vehicles is more a matter of convenience for the consumer than anything else. But having limited mileage that they have, is that what happens if you're out, and your electricity goes down. So I don't know if you guys are looking into that, into what kind of partnerships that there could be stations to recharge these cars in terms of, what happens when your car goes out or if your battery was low or something like that.
Yeah, actually, we're looking at that very thing is sort of the behavioral transformations that are taking place. I mean, the good news is the battery capacities are increasing quite markedly now. I mean, the Model 3 Teslas that are starting to come online, the Bolts now, you're getting ranges that are 200, 300 miles. So that gives you a lot more certainty on your drive. I mean, I think the biggest concern was, hey, if I got to go from point A to point B, but all of a sudden you're putting in point C, D, and E in my day, and I don't know where to charge, that becomes a real issue on the reliability from the consumer standpoint. We actually are seeing consumers now with that battery, sort of that extension, and much more prolific charging. Like I said, we're seeing a lot more workplace charging happening in San Diego. So when they're going to work, they're plugging in, and they're plugging in, like for example, myself, we've got at SDG&E, we've got over 500 employees that are driving electric vehicles right now, over 10% of our workforce. I've got a great behavioral test ground that we're looking at behaviors now on and the types of cars they're driving, and we're seeing them get more of the longer term type of cars, moving away from the hybrids that they kind of stepped into the marketplace with and moving more towards the full battery type of vehicles. I think the gaps right now that we're seeing are sort of the long distance commutes, right? That if I've got to go up to LA and I've got to go longer distance, I might be able to get up there, but I might not be able to get back. And so how do I do that? And you definitely want to get back from LA, right? Yeah. I mean, come on, I'm a San Diegan, right? I want to get back from LA. So how do you do that? And that's where that issue of making sure you've got the right type of public charging infrastructure, but not overdoing it. You don't want to put a charger on each corner. That costs a lot of money. I mean, it costs about $15,000, $20,000 on average to stub, because you're dealing with trenching, you're dealing with infrastructure. It's not just putting a plug somewhere. You're dealing with public charging and you normally want convenience, right? You don't want to wait 8 hours to charge your vehicle, not in LA. You want to be in and out of there. And again, I'm not dissing. I worked in LA. I love LA. But in any event, you do definitely want, we're looking at a lot of those changes in transformation, but we're bouncing it out. I mean, the key is bouncing. You're trying to make sure you're sort of getting it right as consumers change and their own adaptability changes on reliability. The last piece I'll add is just on technology. With apps nowadays, there's a lot more connectivity on where those chargers are and what is green and what's available. There's no more frustration than saying, hey, I know there's a charger at this supermarket. You go there, there's a non-EV parked in that space, and you're like, wait a minute, I need this right now, and it's not reliable. So having the apps that now give you a sense of what's open, what's available, and what the price is changing that consumer behavior.
Okay, we have a question in the back and then one in the front.
This is a question for Mr. Schneider. A big topic in sustainability right now is the electrification of everything.
and the need to move space heating, water heating, and transportation to electrified equipment. As a company that sells both fossil natural gas and renewable electricity, can you talk a little bit about how the company thinks internally about the need to wind down natural gas operations in favor of renewable electricity?
Well, first off, I haven't figured out how to get my electric fire table really to work for me yet. So I do like natural gas at certain end uses, and as well as cooking. I really find a lot of value. And yes, there's a carbon content associated with it. But to me, there's value in that particular energy source. Yeah, we're a combined company. It's SDG&EG, and we've got Southern California Gas Company within our Semper portfolio, as well as our LNG business, which is actually in the process of converting natural gas into liquefaction to send across the ocean to provide energy to other areas to reduce their own carbon content in other ways. So we generally look at a balanced approach in how we're looking at natural gas. Having said that, we also recognize that there's a large contingent out there that's looking at natural gas as sort of a bridge fuel. You know, how long is it going to be in existence? Methane does contribute to harming the environment. There's no doubt about it. That's why fugitive emissions, somebody mentioned that earlier with fracking. I think that's an important point. You've got to be responsible on that and making sure that you're not having fugitive emissions occurring to the extent. But, you know, it's not just natural gas. You know, you have to look at agriculture. In fact, agriculture probably is the biggest source of methane out there. And what are we doing about, you know, our own focus around, you know, a reliance on animal stock and all those other things and sustainability? There is opportunity to sequester a lot of that methane, and that's an area we need to focus in on. And on natural gas, there are lots of opportunities to focus on renewable natural gas as well as focus on, you know, power to gas. I talked a little bit about that earlier, but we've got to accelerate that and look at it in a holistic basis.
Dean Reynolds, you're surrounded by industry, the behemoths of industry here in the Southwest. And I look at these other countries where they're doing things with alternative energy that have really made it cost effective. Look at Germany. Berlin is between the same latitude of Milwaukee and Chicago, and yet they have more solar. And with their other alternative energy sources, they're able to decommission all of their power plants. We have Spanish companies here in southern Arizona, in Cochise County, that are generating megawatts of electricity from wind. And they're defending kind of an obsolete model that's going back 100 years where the people who own shares of stocks in the not natural gas, but town gas, they thought that was the thing that needed to be maintained. I think Mr. Schneider mentioned it earlier, distributed on rooftops for solar. You take an example of Sacramento Municipal Utility District, or MUD, and 12, 15 years ago, they went with the idea that they're going to put on rooftop applications, commercial, churches, private residences, and they were going to share and partner with their clients. And they're actually going to have it cost effective. I don't know if they've gone to 100% yet, but that was something that was on a fast track because of the regulation in California. So I guess I would look at like what Enron had done to the California ratepayers 18 years ago, 17 years ago. They raped them. The only solution truly for the success of this from a standpoint economic as well as security for our country is to put it onto solar, have a battery pack from somebody like Elon Musk at Tesla, and there they generate their own electricity and then have a reserve for 2 or 3 days thereafter if the sun doesn't shine. Could you comment on some of that?
That's a lot to digest, but let me break it up into 3 parts. Yeah, let me pick a couple of points. One is, yeah, I mean, there are parts of the world that are farther along on renewable energy. Germany comes to mind. California is farther along than we are. You know, it's not a free lunch, though. I mean, you know, that's you know, if you look at their electricity rates in Germany, they're much higher. California's are much higher than ours. So, I mean, I don't think the barrier is as much technological as economic. And I think that the key is just finding a way to to find the right pace to do it, find the smart opportunities. The question came up earlier about our policies about whether we should have a carbon tax or something. I think, a national carbon tax or a national cap and trade program that established a price on carbon would be a much more effective way to advance this stuff rather than piecemeal programs of RPSs and the CAFE standards for automobiles and various energy efficiency standards. If you had the right kind of prices for carbon emissions in place to begin with, a lot of the incentives would align and we could move toward that. I guess the other point is I don't necessarily see for-profit businesses like utilities and others as the real bad guys here. I mean, I'm in a business school after all, but again, if they have the right incentives, if they're facing a carbon price or the right incentives, they'll move toward things that make economic sense for them, but also advance some of the things I think many of us would like to see in terms of more clean energy and lower carbon emissions. So I guess those would be at least a couple of points I would make in response.
Thank you. We have one question in the back. We'll take one more, and I think you know who you are because I waved at you. You can shout your question out. I'll repeat it.
Are you talking to me?
There's somebody further back, but if not, okay, last one. Go for it.
My question is this is for Director Schneider. Which emerging battery technology, we discussed a few today, be it hydrodynamic, hydrogen, other forms of energy storage, are you personally most interested in planning on integrating into the California, San Diego grid?
Well, right now. Oh, I'm
Everybody
sorry.
hear the question? Okay.
Yeah, the question was on what battery technology, and right now our focus is predominantly on lithium, and it goes back to what I mentioned before. We're sort of seeing that economic Moore's curve happening with respect to that. We're now down below, I think, $150 a kWh in that level of application, and that price curve is moving very closely to 100 and could potentially go below that if we see what happened with the solar industry. So lithium right now is our main focus. But remember, the downside with lithium is you don't have that long-term storage capability. We might be able to go 4 hours, but we're not going to go much beyond that, which is why flow technologies, and now you're starting to deal with chemistries, flow batteries that actually have chemicals that store electrons, are very intriguing right now. In fact, I've got a group coming out from Tokyo on Monday with a commissioner from the PUC and our California Energy Commission commissioner, and we're going to do a tour of our 2 megawatt flow battery demonstration project that we've got right now, because I really want to look at that technology and see if we can scale it. See if we can scale it with some emerging technologies that are coming into play. Unfortunately, we don't have the pump hydro capabilities at significant forms, but we have a few opportunities we're looking at right now, and then hydrogen down the line provides that much longer term source. But to us, those price curves are still out there, so you're sort of looking at how do you sort of look at each of these things and bridge together. But right now, lithium to flow to maybe one of these other things, these other technologies, is where we're headed right now. And I wouldn't be surprised if we pushed one pump storage project in within the next 10 years.
Thank you. Let's give our panel a round of applause. To our Dean for final comments.
Thank you so much, Mary, for a great moderation session. Thanks to the panelists. I think we have some tokens of appreciation here. So I hope you guys like Wildcat stuff.
Yeah. We don't like those colors, they're ugly.
But this was a great session. I think we all learned a lot. Many questions were added to our minds, which is good when you have this exciting and fascinating discussion. What I'd like to do again is to ask for another round of applause for our panelists. Also thank thank Heather Strasser and Lauren Mosley for putting this together. Great job. And I'd like to announce our next session. It's going to be on January 29th. And the theme is going to be venture capital, equity investment, and the formation of a startup ecosystem. So we're going to have a featured speaker, Andrew Brasher, one of our graduates, is in venture capital in Palo Alto. He helped bring up a lot of tech companies like Facebook and others. And we're going to have a panel with some local investors and also one of our professors. So that's January 29th, and I hope that you can attend it with us. So thanks again, and have a great time.